We're going to do tonight, I want to finish up Genesis by the end of the year. We're not going to have Wednesday night next week because it's Thanksgiving. So we're going to move kind of quick over this segment, which means we can't read everything here, but I highly encourage you to go home and read it. I'll show you the high points of where we're coming and where we're headed. But we may get all the way in through 47 tonight. We'll see. We may not, but we covered the first 15 verses of chapter 45 last week. So I want you to stop for a second now and pull our minds back into this whole saga. We remember that there's a problem, right? There's a famine coming. We know that. This is a problem of the sin curse, and you've got the children of Israel living in the land of Canaan, and the famine's going to come and wipe them all out. You've also got some really carnal brothers. All the tribes of Israel are sinful men, which is not surprising to us. Abraham started out a sinful man. Isaac started out a sinful man. Jacob started out a sinful man. It's no surprise to us that the sons began as sinful men as well. The whole objective, as you know now, is to get the children of Israel into Egypt. Now I would ask you, if you remember, why do we need to get them into Egypt? Can you tell me what are some of the reasons we need to get the children of Israel as a people to move into the land of Egypt? It seems a little strange because the land of promise is Canaan. It's what he promised to Abram. We saw God go to great lengths to keep them in the land, but now they need to leave Canaan. They need to go to Egypt for a time. Do you remember why? All right, there's a famine. That's one reason. Famine's part of what drives them there. So God can rescue them from Pharaoh. Well, that's not wrong, actually, because the Exodus is going to be a major role in what God does in the lives of his people. Up until Jesus comes, the Exodus is their cross. The fact that God intervenes in such a mighty way to show his power in his destruction of Pharaoh. So that's not a wrong statement. That's just way down the line of providence of God, but you're right, that's part of it. Okay, that's what he told Abraham. The sin of the Ammonites is not yet complete. God is not yet prepared or ready or willing to completely wipe out all the inhabitants of the land of Canaan. God has not finished offering grace. He has not finished offering mercy. He has not finished offering salvation, even to the pagans who live in the land of Canaan. And so God's going to give them roughly 450 more years. All they have is what we call natural revelation, which is the creation of God. But he's going to give them that much more time to repent and trust in him before he destroys them. That's true. Other reasons why we're going to Canaan, or going to Egypt, I'm sorry. Okay, the incubator, right? Right now you have the children of Israel. You're going to see this if we make it that far. In chapter 46, I believe it is. 46, verse 27 says, "And the sons of Joseph who were born to him in Egypt were two. All the persons of the house of Jacob who came to Egypt were 70. So 67 of them lived in the land of Canaan, and that was it. That's a relatively small number of a people who are going to try to survive in the midst of a pagan land, right? They have no military. They have no ability. The land is destructive because it's a famine. They have no means of staying alive. They're not going to survive as a small people, 67. There's also a constant threat to them of intermarriage. This has been a big issue every single time one of the boys has grown up. It's been a big deal. Don't let him marry a Canaanite woman. And you remember Abraham sending his servant back to the land to find a wife for Isaac. And you remember Jacob and Esau then, when they were born, Esau displeased his parents because he married a Canaanite. Jacob went back where he found Rachel and Leah. And now you've got these boys, 12 of them, and they're all living in the land of Canaan. And there's this real threat and danger that they're just going to intermarry with the Canaanites. And if you're only 67 people and you begin to intermarry with the Canaanites, before long, you're not going to have any distinction at all left, right? So there's a real threat that they're going to intermarry. To answer all of these problems, the Lord's answer is Egypt. They need to go to Egypt. In Egypt, they'll be protected. In Egypt, they'll be set apart. And there's a reason for that. We've actually talked about it a little, but if you pick up on it, I'm going to give you 1 million Bible points. It's by far the most Bible points I've ever handed out. Give you 1 million Bible points if you can tell me why there's no threat that they will intermarry with Egyptians when they go into the land of Egypt. Taylor? Oh, 1 million Bible points for Taylor. Well, sorry, she beat you there. Yeah. She's well ahead of everybody. They do you no good, and you might cause pride, of which you'll have to repent, but you've got them nonetheless. That's right. Egyptians or Hebrews are loathsome to Egyptians. So there's really no threat that they're going to go there. And by the way, I would remind you, the word Hebrew, they do become the Hebrew people, and they become known as Hebrews. Do you remember where that title comes from? Abraham was the first one to be called a Hebrew. What? Yeah, that's basically it. Hebrew is a slang term. It meant one who crosses over, a river jumper. It was a derogatory term for an illegal alien. And the word Zach used is the word that they might use today. They would call them a wetback that would come over from Mexico, right? I don't mean that bad. It's just what they call them. He gave me the eye like, don't start nothing, won't be nothing, right? Yeah. No, you didn't give me the eye? Okay. But that was the term. That's what Hebrew was. It was a term of derision, like, you don't belong here, you're a foreigner. And foreigners, river jumpers, wetbacks, Hebrews, whatever, were loathsome to Egyptians. We don't want you here. And so Egyptians weren't going to intermarry. They weren't going to form alliances with them. And so you put them in Egypt, and it's a safe place to grow, a safe place to become a nation. There's not a real threat of intermarriage. They're going to stay secluded. And as a matter of fact, you're going to find out here in the book of Genesis as well that not only are Hebrews loathsome to Egyptians, but shepherds are loathsome to Egyptians, to the point that Joseph's going to say, hey, don't tell them you're shepherds, just tell them you raise livestock. So you're going to see God seclude them. Egypt's going to be a great place, and then as Abigail pointed out, it's going to be a tremendous opportunity for God to demonstrate his power. So we have to get the children of Jacob into the land of Egypt. How in the world are we going to do that? What? Famine? Yeah, famine may make them go to Egypt, but what do they do when they get there? You got to have somebody there. Who are we going to put there? Joseph. How are we going to get Joseph to be in power in Egypt? Yeah, let's sell him as a slave. Yeah, but we all know Joseph. If you sell him as a slave, he's going to go be the best little slave there ever was, and there's no way his master is ever going to let him go. I mean, if you had Joseph as a slave, you would want him as a slave for life. There's no way that master is ever going to give Joseph up. What are we going to do to get that master to get Joseph up? What? Yeah, we need to falsely accuse him, right? Well, who would do that, I wonder? Perhaps a crooked wife, right? And so she wants to have an affair with Joseph. He won't do it, so she falsely accuses him, and that's the one sort of sin that the master can't overlook, so we put him in prison. But we need to get Joseph, now that he's out of Potiphar's house, and now that he's in prison, we still need to get his gifts recognized. How are we going to do that? There, Grayson? Yeah, we're going to have to get a cupbearer and a baker into prison with him, let him interpret their dreams. Then we got to get one of them sent back to Pharaoh so he can report to Pharaoh. And then I'm going to have Pharaoh have a dream. I'm going to have the cupbearer tell Pharaoh, I know the guy that can tell dreams. Pharaoh's going to have to send for him. He's going to have to come. He's going to have to be able to interpret the dream. And then he's going to have a plan for fixing the problem. And Pharaoh's going to have to listen to him. And then he's going to have to enact the plan. And you just see all the stuff that had to fall into place. And over all of that, we have what we call the providence of God. Things that if we just looked at them through our human eyes, we would say, that's messed up, that's wrong. What kind of brothers sell their brother into slavery? What kind of woman falsely accuses a young lad? What kind of cupbearer forgets Joseph for 2 years in prison? I mean, this is all wrong. He's suffering unjustly, and then he gets exalted. He sees his brothers. I mean, it's a story that you may think it's coincidence. You may think it's chance. You may think it's a fairy tale ending, but in reality, it's the providence of God. And so we started with what we would just call sending Joseph to Egypt, and that's what God did. It was part of his plan. I want you to pick up in chapter 45, verse 16, and I just want to show you real quickly some other ways that God is clearly at work. In verse 16, it says, now when the news was heard in Pharaoh's house that Joseph's brothers had come, it pleased Pharaoh and his servants. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, say to your brothers, do this, load your beast, go to the land of Canaan, take your father and your households, and come to me, and I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you will eat the fat of the land. Now your order, do this. Take wagons from the land of Egypt for your little ones and for your wives, and bring your father and come. Do not concern yourselves with your goods, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. Then the sons of Israel did so, and Joseph gave them wagons according to the command of Pharaoh, and gave them provisions for the journey. To each of them he gave changes of garments, but to Benjamin he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of garments. To his father he sent as follows, 10 donkeys loaded with the best things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain and bread and sustenance for his father on the journey. Pharaoh is rolling out the red carpet. You agree with that? I mean, look at what Pharaoh does. You come. I want all your family to come. I'm going to give you the best of the land of Egypt. The best that we have is yours. Take wagons, load them up with gifts. Take donkeys, load them up with the best of Egypt and with grain and with bread and with sustenance. And I want you to load up your whole family and bring them here. Now, you may think, well, Pharaoh just really loves Joseph. And that's probably true. But based on what we've learned about Egypt and Hebrews, why is this bizarre? Yeah, Egyptians don't even like Hebrews. And yet you're going to bring an entire family of them here and not just put them over in the, red light district. You're going to give them the best. You're going to fence off for these Hebrews that come the best of the land of Egypt. We are in a famine, Pharaoh. Things aren't really going well right now in Egypt. I realize we've got a plan and we've got a storage, but it's not like this ground's going to grow anything for 5 more years. And you're going to seclude off the best of the land and just give it to these Hebrews. You're going to send supplies to them. I mean, it's not like we have a ton. I know he's made provision, but you're going to load up 20 donkeys worth of supplies and just send it to foreigners and invite them here. I mean, if you pay attention to the news, this is kind of a debate that goes on in our world. I mean, things are tough here, and you're going to send aid to foreigners, and then you're going to load them up and bring them back here, and then you're going to let them live in the best of our land and support them. All of that seems a little far-fetched if you want to know the truth. Why would you do that? Why would Pharaoh do that? God. God's at work, is he not? I mean, it doesn't say God did it, but come on, his fingerprints are all over it. Not only that, look at verse 24. Let's talk about Jacob. So he sent his brothers away, and as they departed, he said to them, do not quarrel on the journey. By the way, the word quarrel there is ragaz, and if you come Sunday morning, you'll see that word again. But the word literally means to tremble. In other words, he's saying, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid when you go. Then they went up from Egypt and came to the land of Canaan to their father Jacob. Now, what kind of track record do these boys have of telling the truth with their father? Not very good. And how prone is the father to believe these boys when they talk? Not very good. He doesn't really do anything they say. He doesn't believe them or trust them. And now they're about to ask him to do what? Leave. This isn't something Jacob's going to want to do. For one, he's an old man. I mean, he's set in his ways. He's secure in the land. Leaving is not something he's going to want to do. But these boys show up, and they tell him in verse 26, Joseph is still alive, and indeed he is ruler over all the land of Egypt. But he was stunned, for he did not believe them. When they told him all the words of Joseph that he had spoken to them, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived, and Israel said, it is enough, my son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. Well, that was much easier than we thought it would be. Imagine going to your grandfather or your dad or somebody that's been really set on a homestead for years after years after years, and you go up to him and say, you know what? I think we need to up and move. Let's just leave this land behind. Everything God has given you, everything God has promised as an inheritance, all of your possession, I say we just load up and leave, and let's go start over in the land of Egypt. No way Jacob's going to want to do that. Why do you suppose he's willing all of a sudden? God, right? But Jacob's going to do something before he goes. Chapter 46, somebody read those first 4 verses. All right, so Jacob goes to Beersheba. 1,000 Bible points if you know why he went to Beersheba. Anybody got it? Any adults want in on this one? Why Beersheba? Jacob has left the land before, hasn't he? When did he leave the first time? You remember? Well, to get a wife, yeah, but that wasn't the initial reason he left. He was running from Esau. And he fled from Esau, and on the way, he took a little nap, and he saw a ladder from heaven, and he saw the angels of God ascending and descending on the ladder. Anybody want to guess where that was? It's only worth 2 Bible points now because I've given you a lot of... Beersheba, yeah. And what did God tell him that night when he sees the angels of God ascending and descending? Do you remember what God promised Jacob that night? Do what? Okay. I appreciate you mumbling where nobody could understand. That's right. I'm going to bring you back. You're going, but I will bring you back to this land. Remember, Jacob said, well, if you do, you'll be my God when I get back. But he said, I'll bring you back. So now, as Jacob is plotting to leave the land a second time, before he goes right back to that same spot where God intervened before. And he goes back to Beersheba. And God again speaks to Jacob and says, it's me. I am God. You can go to Egypt. Don't be afraid. I'm going to make you a great nation there. It's the incubator. I'm going to go with you, and you're coming back. Now, not you physically, because Joseph will close your eyes. You're going to die there. But your people are coming back. So he goes, and God now has intervened again to move his people into Egypt. And if you read verses 5 down through verse 27, which we did Sunday night if you were here, and I'm not reading all those names again. We get down to verse 26 and 27. After listing all the sons and their sons, it says, all the persons belonging to Jacob who came to Egypt, his direct descendants, not including the wives of Jacob's sons, were 66 persons in all. And the sons of Joseph who were born to him in Egypt were 2. All the persons of the house of Jacob who came to Egypt were 70. And that's what you say, success. God has moved them to Egypt. He has done really the impossible. Now, did God come to Joseph early in life and say, all right, Joseph, here's the deal. I don't care how you do it, but you've got to get your family to move to Egypt? Did he say, Jacob, I don't care how you do it, but you have got to get your family to move to Egypt? Reuben, Simeon, Judah, listen, your life depends on it. The only survival of your people, if you don't get them to move to Egypt, you'll never last. Does God do that? No. And do you suppose that the salvation of you or your family or all of those things depends upon you either? God's at work. This is the providential hand of God to move and work and guide and direct and cause. Now, granted, God accomplishes his purposes in ways that we might never comprehend. He accomplishes purposes in ways that we might never volunteer for if we knew it. If God went to Joseph and said, okay, I'm going to use you to get your brothers into Egypt. Here's how we're going to do it. You're going to be hated, thrown in a well, sold into slavery, betrayed by your master's wife, thrown into prison where you're going to spend, roughly 13 years of your life in pure-blown suffering. What do you say? And at that point you say, I think Benjamin would do really well, right? We probably wouldn't sign up for that type of stuff if we knew it ahead of time, and yet God uses it. It's not just, and this is where there's a mistake sometimes. The way our world likes to look at suffering is they like to look at suffering like it caught God totally unaware. Like suffering just accidentally plopped into our life, and God was like, oh no! And somebody will say, it's not that God causes suffering, it's that God is with us when it comes. Well, that's true, he is with you when it comes. But who caused all this? God did. He is sovereign over those things. And granted, sometimes suffering is bad. I guess it's always bad. The writer of Hebrews said it's not joyful, but sorrowful. The things you walk through in life. I was listening, Zach found it and got us all on it, but Steve Lawson's podcast about, what's it called, Men Who Rock the World? It's just church history biographies of starts with the reformers and goes through a lot. But anyway, I was listening to the one on George Whitefield. They call him probably the greatest evangelist that America ever knew. George Whitefield, it talks about, he's come to America and back to England over and over and over, and he's preaching everywhere and preaching to thousands, sometimes one time to 30,000 people in a field. He's preaching all the time. He meets a woman, he gets married, and she travels with him, and she gets pregnant, and the child dies at a very young age. In fact, he dies in the same house that Whitefield was born in, and they have his funeral in the same church that Whitefield preached his first sermon in. And Steve Lawson's talking about the death of this child and how crushing it was to Whitfield. And the point that Lawson makes, now granted, neither Lawson nor I nor Whitfield at the time knew why God did this. But Lawson just makes the point. Oftentimes, before God uses people for his really great work, he breaks them first. They have to be crushed of pride and crushed of dependence. And God uses sometimes what we see to be extremely cruel, maybe wrong, unjust means of suffering. But God doesn't view things in time and space like we do. Because while Whitfield would live another 30 years missing the son that died, Whitfield's been with that son now for, 150 years before the throne of God, as though it was a distant memory, right? I mean, it's just like that now. So you understand, it may seem cruel at the moment, but God, who views things in the scope of eternity, uses things maybe that we view to be unorthodox, but he does it. He's sovereign. And here we find that God gets them to Egypt, okay? So by the end of chapter 46, they're in Egypt. And let's talk a little bit about the benefits of Egypt. I think this is important. If you pick up in verse 28, this kind of goes to the answer of why Egypt's important. For one, this is the blessing of God sort of that comes after all the suffering. For one, they're finally a united family again. Look at it in verse 29. Somebody read that.
Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as he appeared before him, he fell on his neck and wept on his neck alone.
Can you imagine what that was like when Joseph and Jacob saw each other again? I mean, that was a sweet moment. That was a joyful moment. There was relief. There was rejoicing. Jacob even says in verse 30, "Let me die since I've seen your face, that you're still alive." I mean, that's all I really wanted in life. So, I mean, that's a happy thing that God brought out of this. Not only that, but you find out that they have now been preserved as a nation, because Jacob now says, look, here's the deal. You guys are shepherds. This is verse 32, keepers of livestock. When Pharaoh asks you, verse 33, what's your occupation, you tell him we're keepers of livestock, because shepherds are loathsome to Egyptians. You find out verse 34. But when you get to chapter 47, they come in, they tell Pharaoh that your servants are shepherds, verse 3, because the brothers never can seem to do what they're told. Pharaoh said to his brothers, what's your occupation? And they say, your servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers. And that seems like it's going to be a train wreck now, doesn't it? I told you not to tell him you're shepherds. I told you to tell him you keep livestock. Great, you've ruined everything, except they tell Pharaoh, we have come to sojourn in the land, and they say, can we stay in Goshen? And by the way, Goshen is the best of the land. And look at what Pharaoh says in verse 6. The land of Egypt is at your disposal. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them live in the land of Goshen. If you know any capable men among them, then put them in charge of my livestock. What? I mean, God now has protected them. He has turned the heart of Pharaoh so that Pharaoh is now embracing people that were formerly loathsome to him on a number of levels. And God has now chosen to give them their own secluded land, the best of the land of Egypt. Now, I think about it like this. I don't ever really see a need or a reason to ever really want to leave Texas. I'm fond of it. I like it. But if God were to come and say, but you do have to leave Texas, Rory, I'm sorry, you have to go. But here's what I've got for you. I have got a nice little set of mountain cabins for you in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, and there's a nice little stream and a golf course across the street, and you're going to live there with 60 or 70 other believers that all love Jesus, and you're going to live there in this nice little wonderful mountain environment in this paradise on earth. Then I might say, well, okay, on second thought, that sounds pretty good. And that's what God's just done for them. I'm sending you to Egypt, but come on, man, I'm going to put you in the best of the land, and you're going to be secluded with your family. Not only that, they're spared from disaster. Look down to verse 12. While they're there, Joseph provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food according to the little ones. And while you go to Colorado, Rory, don't worry about working. I'm just going to provide for you. I'll just send a truck, every other week, loaded down with all the food you want to eat and all the goods. And you just enjoy your time there while I provide for you in your nice little happy, commune. Okay. Not only that, God makes them favored above the world. Now, this is where it gets a little lengthy. But if you look at verses 13 down through verse 27, let me sort of paraphrase for you what begins to happen. So the famine keeps coming. And you'll notice that in verse 13 it says that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. And so Joseph now gathers all the money that's found in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan for the grain. So here's what begins to happen. The people, even in Egypt, start running out of food. Now, when they run out of food, where do you think they go? They go to Joseph. And what does Joseph tell them? Does anybody know? Anybody know? He says, all right, I'll sell you grain. I'll sell you grain. I mean, that's why we stored it, right? So he begins to sell the Egyptians grain. Well, this is 5 more years of famine. What do you think happens? They run out of grain, right? I mean, he sold them some, but 5 years, they run out. But now they have no grain and they have no what? No money. So they go back to Joseph and say, we have no grain and we have no money. And Joseph says, give me the deed to your land. If you'll give me the deed to your land, I will take your land and I will in exchange give you grain. And the people of Egypt say, sounds like a deal to me. And so all the land becomes Pharaoh's. Joseph takes it in exchange for the grain. But then guess what happens? They run out of grain. And now they have no money and they have no land. And they go back to Joseph again and they say, hey, we want more grain. Does anybody know what Joseph takes this time? Nope. Nope. Their freedom. If you'll be a slave to Pharaoh, I'll give you the land. And everybody, you can read that and go, well, that cruel Joseph, boy, what a trick he played on these people. Except look down in verse 25. So they said, you have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's slaves. Okay, so Joseph, through the process of saving grain, saves the land of Egypt, and in the process acquires all the wealth, all the land, and all the people of Egypt to Pharaoh. They, in effect, become slaves of Pharaoh, all the Egyptians. They lose all their property. They lose all their money. And so in this 5-year period, Egypt becomes the slaves of Pharaoh. And you say, oh my gosh, well, what's happening to the Hebrews? Well, look at verse 26. Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, valid to this day, that Pharaoh should have the fifth. Only the land of the priest did not become Pharaoh's. Now, Israel lived in the land of Egypt in Goshen, and they what? Acquired property in it and were fruitful and became very numerous. Do you see the contrast? While all the Egyptians are becoming slaves of Pharaoh, the Hebrews are profiting. They're actually acquiring property. They're actually doing well for themselves, which means because Pharaoh has placed them in the best of the land, they're able to be self-sustaining. They're even having abundant extra, and they're following the lead of Joseph. And they're doing to the Egyptians the same thing that Joseph is doing to the Egyptians. And while it's getting tight, Joseph, Pharaoh, and the Hebrews, they're profiting all the more. They're doing well. So now, not only did I leave Texas to go to Colorado and find this great abode in the mountains with a river and a golf course, I have now acquired the local ski range right across the other length, right? And now, other people, I have acquired many log cabins around me because they wanted food out of the truck that God was bringing to me, and I've been feeding them, and in exchange, I own that cabin and that cabin and that cabin and that cabin, and I've just gotten wealthier and wealthier, and you think, you know what? I think I'm all right with Colorado. I mean, wouldn't that be the thought? Texas schmexes, right? I'm going to be in Colorado for the rest of my life. But here's where we end. It's very important. Down to verse 28. I want you to read 28 to 31. 28 to 31.
Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, so the length of Jacob's life was 137. When the time for Israel to die drew near, he called his son Joseph and said to him, please, if I have found favor in your sight, place now your hand under my thigh and deal with me in kindness and a faithfulness. Please do not bury me in Egypt, but when I lie down with my fathers, you shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in the burial place. And he said, I will do as you have said. He said, swear to me. So he swore to him. Then Israel bowed and worshipped at the house of God.
All right. Can anybody deny that going into Egypt has been a brilliant decision? It's been brilliant. I mean, they're living in the best land. They're prospering. Everything is good. They're safe. They're secure. The world around them is in shambles, but they're doing great. And the temptation would be to say, you know what? How about we just make our home now here in Goshen? I'm not really worried about that land anymore. What do you say, guys? Y'all think Goshen can be our land? That would be the temptation, wouldn't it? To forsake the promise, to keep the present. But what does Jacob do? It's great. It's one of my favorite stories in the Bible. Jacob's getting ready to die, and what's he do? Do not bury me here. It is a reminder to the sons. Has God been good to us here? Yes. Has God given us a refuge to meet our needs? Yes. Has God blessed us extensively in this land? Yes. Has God been good to us, and are we here by the plan and providential work of God? Yes. But this is not the inheritance. This is not what we're here for. There's such an application now to us, especially in America, this land of opportunity, the American dream, all of that kind of stuff. And one of the great threats and dangers that you can face in this life is that if you go through high school and you do well in school and all of that, and someone tells you you have to go to college and get a degree, and you do that, and you get a job and you make a lot of money and you meet a good-looking spouse and you raise good-looking kids and you have a nice home and maybe even a summer home and you do really well and you've got your nice little plantation, and the real danger is that you begin to think that this is the payoff, that this is the treasure, and you begin to forsake the future for the present. And all along, Jesus is saying, do not store up treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal. But store up what? Treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy and thieves do not break in or steal. I want you to turn to one passage real quick, Hebrews chapter 11, and we'll end here and pick back up next week. Hebrews chapter 11. And I want you to think about Jacob when you read this. I mean, previously we would think about Abraham, but now I want you to think about Jacob when we read this. Hebrews 11, 13 through 16. Hebrews 11, 13 to 16. Just a second, we'll let everybody get there before we read. All right, Hebrews 11, look at verse 13, and think about Jacob now. All these died in faith without receiving the promises. Now think about Jacob there. Where did he die? Egypt. He didn't have the land when he died. He didn't own the land when he died, did he? But having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, is that true? Yeah, take me back to that land and bury me. Having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Oh, I forgot a verse to read you. Hold your place right there. I'm going to go back and read you one verse that we missed. This will make more sense. In Genesis 47, when Pharaoh met Joseph or Jacob, Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How many years have you lived?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The years of my sojourning are 130. Few and unpleasant have been the years of my life, nor have they attained the years that my fathers lived during the lives and the days of their sojourning." And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. Pharaoh said, "How long have you lived?" He said, "I lived 130 cruel years. It's been hard." Notice this. It says that they welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Isn't that what Jacob said? This world has not been good to me. This world is not my home. This is not what I want. Verse 14. For those who say such things make it clear that they're seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they'd been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. In other words, if Jacob had just been thinking about the land of Goshen, he'd have had plenty of opportunity to make that his home. But as it is, they desire a better country. That is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. It was never about Egypt. It was never about the present. It was always about the promise of God. And when you live this life, you may not have a, quote, promised land that God has promised you, but guess what? This whole ball, this whole globe we live on, this earth, the Bible says is going up in flames. That the elements will be destroyed with intense heat. It's not going to make it. He's going to implode this place. He's going to destroy it all. The place where you sit right now will someday melt in flame. It's going to burn, all of it. It won't last. And if all of your treasure and all of your blessing and all of your joy and all of your inheritance is bound up here, what's going to happen to it? It's going to be gone. Up in smoke. It's going to burn. That's why it has to be in heaven. That is not to begrudge when God treats us well, and he does. That is not to begrudge when God gives us temporal blessings, and he does. That is not to begrudge when God gives us temporal favor and provision and care and even a sense of comfort and luxury. Clearly, he did that for his people. Now, not every person always gets that. Joseph went a long time when he didn't have it. Now he does, and that's not to begrudge any of that. But never get fooled as to think that this American dream, this plan that I'm going to grow up and I'm going to be successful, I'm going to get a job and I'm going to get a wife or a husband and I'm going to get a lot of money and I'm going to buy a nice house and I'm going to retire on a golf course and I'm just going to live and do whatever I want. How sad if that's it. If that's all you get out of life, you got nothing. Because someday you will leave that behind. Someone else will move into your house or your kids will sell it. I mean, it's just the way it'll be. This is not the inheritance. This is not it at all. You've got to look to the next one, which Jacob does. And we'll talk about it more because he gets through to his boys. Joseph's going to say, I get it now. Everybody get ready. We may not be leaving today, but we're leaving sometime. And we'll talk about that more next week. So, any questions or comments? All right. Well, Quincy, you want to start us? We'll pray tonight.